What if a ship drifts across the ocean with no one left aboard? Tonight, I'm bringing you 5 true and deeply disturbing encounters on abandoned ships, real disappearances, real investigations, real horror at sea. From a 19th century ghost brig to modern vessels found adrift, each story will chill you. Stick around for eyewitness details and the creepy little clues investigators found. If you love maritime mysteries and eerie true stories, hit like and subscribe now. Also, comment below which story shocked you most, or tell us your own horror encounter. I read every comment. Turn on notifications so you don't miss the next deep dive. I still see the Mary Celeste in my mind as if it happened only yesterday. I was 25 when I stepped aboard her in the gray dawn of early November, ready for our long voyage from New York City. The salty air stung my nostrils, and I remember the creak of the wooden deck beneath my boots. The harbor was alive with the calls of gulls and the clang of chains, and I could smell tar and wood smoke in the air. As New York faded into the morning mist, I took my place among the crew, eager and a little anxious, bracing myself for the journey ahead. My heart thumped with a strange mixture of fear and excitement. I had no idea then that this voyage might change my life forever. The Mary Celeste was a sturdy brigantine, her tall masts rising against the sky. Below decks, nearly 2,000 wooden barrels of strong alcohol filled the hold from bow to stern, a cargo of spirits bound for Italy. The fumes clung to the wood around us, so thick it felt like we were breathing in the liquor itself. The sweet, sharp smell of the alcohol lingered in the air, a reminder that we carry danger as well as wealth. Captain Briggs was a calm, confident man, kind to us, but he took no chances with safety, and he had brought his wife, Sarah, and their 2-year-old daughter, Sophia, aboard with us. Sophia often napped on deck during the day, wrapped in blankets. Her quiet laughter or sleepy sighs became a distant lullaby against the creaking timbers of the ship. In those first days, the Mary Celeste felt like a safe, living place under our feet. Days passed beneath a bright November sun and fair winds. The horizon spread out flat and endless, a vast blue canvas under a sky without a single cloud. We settled into a steady routine: morning watch, midday meals, and dinners under a canopy of stars. At dusk, some of the crew would gather on deck, singing old sea shanties and sharing stories to keep our spirits high. In the afternoons, I would sit on deck with the sun on my back, eating dry hardtack and listening to the sea's soft whistle. Once or twice, dolphins danced alongside us, their backs flashing silver as they surfaced in our wake. Each night, we slept in bunks, gently rocked by the motion of the ship. For a while, the world felt kindly to us, but around the 3rd week of our journey, something changed. The air grew heavy and thick, as if the sea had exhaled something foul. Late one evening, I was on watch and felt a strange hush on the deck. This quiet unsettled me more than any roar of wind, as if the entire sea and sky were holding their breath. The sky, once clear, had gathered low, gray clouds. The wind turned colder and began to moan in the rigging, and I felt the first drops of rain on my cheek as I watched those distant clouds hurry closer. A chill ran down my spine. I looked over at Richardson, our first mate, and saw something similar in his eyes. We both tightened our grip on the rail, wondering what the night would bring. By midnight, the gale was upon us. Waves rose like dark mountains, and the wind howled through the sails like a living beast. Water rushed across the deck faster than we could bail it away, and every bolt and rope sang and groaned under the strain. The captain barked orders as we fought to control the sails. My hands were raw from climbing the rigging in the cold night air. Lightning split the sky, turning the sea white in a blinding instant, and thunder cracked over the waves like cannon fire. In that glare, I saw a monstrous wave bearing down on me. I flung myself to the railing and caught a line as it swept over. The cold spray hit my face like a bucket of ice. My heart pounded in my chest, and my boots barely held me to the deck. Even Richardson grabbed my arm to steady me and shouted, "Hold on!" Each of us felt the storm's fury. Above all the noise, I heard Sarah scream from below decks. We were fighting for our lives, each moment a battle. When morning came, the storm had passed as quickly as it had arrived. The sea lay flat and still under pale light, and on deck we saw torn rigging and the mainsail slumped like a broken wing. We sat together in silence, shivering from exhaustion as much as cold. The pounding had been one of the pumps so badly that Captain Briggs had it disassembled on the spot. Later, I joined 2 others at the hand pump, hauling water from the hold. I was startled to see bilge water sloshing a foot deep among the barrels. We had weathered worse storms before, but that sight still put a knot of worry in my stomach. Nobody spoke as we worked. The weight of what had happened hung heavy between us. Occasionally, one of us would mumble a prayer or force a small grin, as if trying to pretend it was just another bad night at sea. In the days after the storm, the mood on board had turned quiet and uneasy. We all knew something was wrong, though nobody said it aloud. Each man busied himself with tasks, mending sails, checking ropes, scrubbing the deck, as if work could keep panic at bay. Even Sarah noticed. Her usually bright eyes were shadowed, and little Sophia clung to her mother's skirt more than ever. Captain Briggs spent hours inspecting the hull with Richardson, and I sometimes caught him listening at the cabin door late at night, the air below deck smelling damp and stale. One night I awoke to hear the hush of voices, Captain Briggs and Richardson, talking by lantern light, but I couldn't make out the words. When I finally asked one of the seamen what was wrong, he only sighed, shook his head, and said nothing. We all felt it, a growing sense that something had shifted out on that ocean. Then everything happened at once. Late on a moonless night, a second squall blew in off the ocean, sudden and fierce. We scrambled to keep the sails from ripping as the wind rattled the rigging once more. Lightning flashed and the sea roared. I clung to the wheel in terror, tasting salt on my lips. Each command from Captain Briggs felt like a matter of life or death. In the chaos, I heard Sarah cry out from below and prayed it would pass quickly. Before the storm could fully hit, I made out Captain Briggs' voice above the din. "Abandon ship." His tone was calm but urgent, and I saw sweat glistening on his brow as he repeated the order. For a moment, time slowed. I remember the sting of the cold wind on my face and the pounding of my heart, but then we moved into action. By lantern light, we bundled into the lifeboat. Captain Briggs helped Sarah and little Sophia down first. The child trembled and hid her face against her mother's shoulder. As Sarah stepped down, her face was pale in the lantern glow. The rest of us followed, stacking a few belongings and provisions in the small boat. I tried to stay calm as I climbed in, but fear was a stone in my stomach. I sat shaking but determined, clutching our handful of rations and flares. I took one last look at the Mary Celeste as I leaned over the side. She lay in the waves, sails slack, a dark silhouette against the starlight. In that final lantern beam, even her lantern was still aglow, flickering against the silence. We waved from our tiny boat, a final farewell to our floating home, and then we rowed away into the night. In the darkness, after that night, the oars stopped and the Mary Celeste became just another silhouette in the waves. All we could hear was the drip of water and the creak of her timbers as she faded behind us. We drifted under a sky heavy with stars, yet even those seemed distant and muted in my numb eyes. I shivered despite the warmth of the night. My heart hammered loudly in my chest. No one spoke. No one had it in them. Everyone stared silently at the dark water between us, wondering what we had done. In that silence, I stared at the spot where she had been, half expecting the sea to swallow her whole. I often wondered if we had chosen rightly to leave her. Even now, the cold spray still wakes me on sleepless nights, and I can hear the ocean's whisper calling me back to that long-gone voyage. Some say the Mary Celeste was found adrift and deserted days later, a ghost ship with all aboard vanished. I know our truth, and it haunts me every day. None of us were ever heard from again, and to the world, our story became as empty as that silent sea. The sea holds its secrets deep down, but I will carry the memory of that voyage, the terror, the loss, and the unanswered questions, with me forever. Each time the wind picks up or the waves pound, I remember her. In my heart, Mary Celeste sails on, and so do I, still adrift in the mystery of that night. I still remember the phone call like it was a snapped rope, sudden, sharp, impossible to ignore. I was on shift that morning, routine checks, coffee gone cold on the bridge table, when dispatch crackled across the radio. Vessel sighted, unmanned. Drifted east of the reef. Approach with caution. I felt my stomach drop in an odd mix of adrenaline and dread. We'd responded to abandoned vessels before, but nothing prepares you for the silence that greets you when you finally come alongside. By the time we reached the coordinates, the sun had climbed high, and the sea looked deceptively calm, flat like a polished table. Off the starboard bow, a white hull bobbed, small, neat, and oddly familiar. Up close, it was clear this was no derelict left to rot for years. The canvases were still intact. The engine was idling. Things that should have moved people were oddly still. An open book on a table, a coffee cup with a dried ring, a laptop asleep on the seat. It felt staged, like someone had frozen the ship in a single moment and walked away. When my partner and I climbed aboard the Catamaran, the deck creaked under our boots. The first thing that hit me was the ordinary, small items scattered as if their owners would return in a minute. A pair of sunglasses lay near a hatch. A towel hung over the stanchion, still damp. Fishing lines trailed from the stern. I remember thinking, this is not the work of thieves. There were no broken locks, no signs of struggle, but the atmosphere was heavy, like a theater after a terrible play had ended, and no one had the courage to leave. We moved through the cabin in slow, practiced motions. Doorways and cushions, the scrubbed wood, the faint smell of diesel. The water bottle with half a drink had a ring of salt crystals. My hand brushed the laptop keyboard, warm, as if it had been used just minutes earlier. The radio panels were awake, showing channels but no recent calls logged. The main engine, I learned, was still set to idle. In my head, the puzzle pieces didn't fit. Why leave a functional boat? Why leave food, clothing, and papers behind? As we searched, the eerie small things kept piling up. On the navigation table lay a boat log marked with recent coordinates and a short note, fishing, calm, will return after lunch. The handwriting was hurried, the ink slightly smudged. In the galley, I found a half-finished cup of coffee, the crusty remains of a sandwich, and an untouched jar of jam. It was like they had stood up mid-meal and vanished. My skin crawled. Later, when I found the life jacket stacked but unused in the locker, the hairs on my neck raised for good. The dinghy, the small rescue boat that should have been used to get to shore if something went wrong, was still lashed to the roof with the painter line taut. That made no sense. If something dire had happened, they would have taken what they could. Instead, the scene gave me the impression of suddenness, of an absence created in a breath. Back on the bridge of our vessel, we radioed for a tow and for investigators. That night, we anchored the Catamaran and kept a watch. The ocean at dusk felt like a glass bowl over a dark secret, brilliant orange and then black. The wind said nothing. Every time I peered through binoculars at the empty deck, I felt a needle of fear. The small world aboard that Catamaran was exactly where people should have been, and yet it was painfully, entirely empty. Days later, the coroner and marine investigators started piecing things together. We talked to experts, combed records, and checked the GPS history. The vessel's owners had left on a short fishing trip with 3 friends. All were experienced seamen, used to the rough patch off those coasts. The official inquest would later point to a tragic accident, a tangled fishing line, an abrupt fall into choppy water, and a chain reaction of desperate choices. But being there, walking across that silent deck, I knew too well that the paperwork would never capture the full landscape of terror those men must have felt. It's the small flashpoints I can't shake, a deckhand tangled in line and pulled over the edge, the sound of his boots slapping the hull, the sudden weight of the rope as he dragged through cold water. When I close my eyes, I hear it, the sharp intake of breath, the wet slap of life vests inflated too late. Then, one by one, the terrible domino falls. One man dives to retrieve his friend, and that second man, despite his strength, is not prepared for the chaotic dragging of a frantic partner. The third tries to cut away lines, but in the chaos the boom swings like a sleeping giant and strikes him down. It's swift and mean and all too possible. When you imagine it, the ocean seems indifferent. It does not care if you are skilled. It only responds to physics and force. A line caught on a cleat, a sudden lurch, a moment when balance fails, and you have a life or death second that demands the right reflex, the perfect choice. People make split decisions in those seconds because they are human. They love one another and they try to save each other. We do not always choose wisely with panic in our veins. After the investigators concluded their inquiries, the scenario that made the most sense ran like this. A fishing line snared, a man overboard, another man jumping in to help, and a third rushing to drop sail only to be struck by the swinging boom. The sea was choppy and cold, the boat unstable, and the three men, though strong and experienced, were outmatched by a sudden error and the ocean's harshness. They drowned. Their bodies were never found. I remember the official who spoke those words in a quiet, professional voice. He said it as though the statement could make it all neat and final. It did not. The images of their last minutes were impossible to erase. I kept seeing the dining area, the half-drunk coffee, the laptop with its screen dark. The ordinary things made the end feel cruel, because they were reminders of life continuing where life ended. People asked me later if I had felt something supernatural aboard that catamaran. They wanted eerie creaks and a cold whisper behind the neck. I won't deny there was an eerie hush, but it was the kind of hush that belongs to places where life has abruptly stopped, not some otherworldly voice. I remember that when we first boarded, I expected to feel the presence of someone. Instead, I felt the weight of absence. Absence hangs heavy. It magnifies ordinary things into evidence of a sudden exit. It can make a towel seem like a clue, a cup like a message. The silence itself becomes a loud accusation. When we towed the catamaran back to port, curious locals gathered and pointed at the empty boat tied to the quay. News vans arrived. The men's families were called. There were interviews and statements, apologies and condolences, and little else that could bring meaning to the empty seats and the lost voices. I watched the faces of those who knew them, their fellows, their neighbors, and I saw grief like a physical thing. Their eyes were red and distant, their mouths set. The open cup and the damp towel, things that had surprised me at the scene, now acted as little testaments to a life that had been interrupted mid-breath. Sometimes, after a complicated mission like that, I would stand on the deck by myself at dawn and think about the smallest, most human parts of the story. I thought about the cheap plastic coffee cup. I thought about the laptop sleeping on its cushion like a closed book. I thought about hands reaching and failing, about how quickly the ocean can turn a day of laughter and lines and sun into the last scene of everything. It's the human detail that lingers. Not the statistics, not the official reports. A sandwich, a towel, a sun hat bent by breeze. The human life is shown inside those objects more clearly than in any boardroom. On quiet nights, I hear that bell again. Not a bell of the ship, but an internal alarm. It's a reminder. Respect the sea. Respect the lines, the gear, the simplest safety routines. Those men were strong. They knew what they were doing. The sea still beat them. And for me, who had walked across the cabin and seen the things they left behind, it became a lesson I carry like an old scar. We all make stories to soften the edge of such grief. Telephone rumors, wild ideas about pirates or secrets. The internet offered its version too, dramatic, sensational, tempting to swallow like a quick tale. But in the end, the simplest explanation was the one that fit without forcing any details. Accidents happen. The ocean is an honest, brutal teacher, and sometimes the price for a small misstep is too high. If you ask me now what lingered most from that mission, I will tell you it was the silence and the ordinary items left behind. If you ask what I felt when we stepped off the vessel and walked back to our own ship, I will say this: a sense of hollow respect and a new, deeper caution. I learned that day that bravery and skill do not make you invulnerable. They only reduce the risk. The sea does not care for bravado. It rewards preparation and punishes error. Months after the catamaran was found, I went back to the harbor where she had been tied and stood on the same quay. The boat had been cleaned and the stains removed, but every now and then you could still see the faint ring of salt on the rail where a coffee cup had been. Those faint ghosts of small things are more powerful, I think, than any headline. They are reminders that life is fragile, sudden, and filled with ordinary details that mean everything in the end. If I tell this story to others now, to young sailors, to friends, to curious strangers, I do not dress it up. I tell it plain. I tell them about the coffee cup, the laptop, the towel, and the triple fall into cold water. I tell them about the math of panic and the elegance of small safety steps. Some will take the lesson to heart. Some will only listen and move on. The sea keeps doing what it does either way. But if you ever find yourself near a quiet boat, if you ever step aboard a craft where life seems to have paused, look for the small things. They are the only honest witnesses left. And when you see them, remember the men who vanished into a single brutal second. Remember the voice that called for help and the friends who answered even if the sea did not answer back. Remember that bravery is real. Remember that the ocean forgives almost nothing. And most of all, remember to tie the lines tight, check the gear twice, and treat every knot like a promise you might need to keep. They called the call sign in a voice full of panic. Short, dariwa, broken, Morse, then silence. Then, a final message. 2 little words. I die. I still hear that tap-tap in my head, like a clock counting down. I was a radio operator then. Young, hungry for anything out of the ordinary. That night, the static was thick. The words came through, and they didn't belong to any man I knew. I tell you this slow, so you can breathe, so you can feel the weight of what it was like to hear a ship beg for help. Not with a long speech, but with a simple, desperate sentence. We went. Of course we went. No one leaves a distress call unanswered. Not then. Not ever. When you're a seaman. The sea was flat. A quilt of ink. No moon. The stars were pinpricks. We followed the coordinates like a needle to a vein. Closer. Closer. And then the silhouette rose. The ship floated like a sleeping thing. Black against black. Her name? Ourang Medan. A name that tasted foreign on my tongue. We pulled alongside. My knees shook. Not from cold. From the feeling that the whole world had paused. The first glimpse was nothing. A deck strewn with rigging. An officer's cap on the rail. A cup overturned. Ordinary things. But they lay wrong. Like props left on a stage after the actors fled. I climbed. The gangway groaned. I remember the smell first. It was not the sea. It was the chill of metal and old breath. There was a copper tang in the air, and something else. A stillness that pressed on my lungs. I saw them then, spread out on the deck, faces upturned to the sky, mouths open, eyes frozen wide. The captain, the officers, men in coats, all of them like mannequins, but not arranged, collapsing, sudden, like someone had cut the thread on a line of puppets. A dog lay nearby, small, frozen, all the life gone at once. I reached out. I wanted to shake one of them, to see if the cold that claimed them could be nudged away. My hand met skin. not the warm skin of a sleeping sailor. It was cold as a tombstone. I felt the ribs under the shirt, and then the silence grew louder. We made no sound for a long moment, only the wind in the stay. It was a stupid, small sound in a huge, empty place. My mind supplied reasons. Gas dye, carbon monoxide, a spill, a fight, anything but the shape of the truth. We checked the cabins, rooms that held stories. Tables with maps, a logbook, charts, everything in place. A pipe still in the captain's hand, a cigar burned to nothing. It looked like they had simply stopped mid-breath, like a photograph taken during a scream. I remember the writing on the log. The ink had run. The hand became a scrawl near the end. No time for neatness, just the scratching of a pen trying to keep pace with terror. I tried to be methodical. We are taught to be methodical. Search the rooms, test the pumps, check the engine room. Listen for anything that would explain this hush. The engine room was a black cave. We stepped down into it, like intruders into someone else's throat. Steam pipes lined the walls. The gauges stood frozen. No clatter, no life, only the dull throb of the ship, as if it were breathing shallow. There were no wounds, no blood, no signs of a fight, no bullet holes, no knife marks, just dead men, and the feeling that they had looked at something so awful that their faces decided to stay that way. We radioed. We sent the news back. We waited for patrol. While we waited, the smell spread. Metal and dust and the dry bouquet of something burned inside me. It clung to the hair on my arms. It sat in my throat. Then the fog crept in. Then at first, a finger of mist that curled over the rail. I watched it crawl along the decking and into the hatches. I told myself it was only weather, sea spray, and fog, a thing to be expected on long nights. But the fog did not behave like fog should. It moved like breath around corners. It slid into spaces with a mind of its own. And the men on the deck, their faces were starting to change. I do not want to make this finer than it was. I am not a poet at moments of fear, but you saw what I saw. Their skin, pale as chalk. And then there were strange blotches crawling under the surface, dark veins mapping out like roots, eyes still open, lips pulled back as though mid-sigh. We moved to carry them below, to warm them, or to lay them in the galley and try to find pulse. There was none. It was like handling ghosts that had once been solid. Aboard our own ship, I remember us speaking softly, like musicians in a church. We tried to catalog. We tried to make sense. Names, ranks, times. It all seemed absurd in the face of a silence that filled the hold. Others came, a salvage crew, men in hard boots and harder jaws. They looked at the bodies and then at each other in a way that men do when a safe world breaks. They suggested the hold. They suggested fumes from a cargo. They suggested some corrosive chemical, some hidden cargo of death. Some of the men tried to open trunks. They pulled at doors and drawers, but in those drawers lay the life of a crew. Letters home, photographs, Ald's drawing. Nothing sinister. When the doc came, he moved with a slow, clinical gaze. He checked the throats. He tested tempers and reflexes. "I cannot explain this," he said, and the words hung in the air like a missing piece. And then the holding tanks began to smoke. It rose slow and silver. At first, we thought we could contain it. We tried fans. We tried to ventilate. We opened portholes. The smoke changed. It thickened. It tasted metallic. One of the men coughed once. He staggered. He fell. We got him to the rail. He shook. His eyes rolled back. In moments, he lay down. We tried to drag him below to safety. He did not wake. Panic is a bright, hot thing. It makes men do raw, terrible things. Some of the salvage crew wanted to leave. Others wanted to tow the ship. But the smoke thickened, and by then we believed something in the ship wanted out. Then the ship began to heat from below. Not the warmth of the sun. A furnace. The hull belched a groan. And when the heat built, we felt it like a drumbeat beneath our feet. Their cargo hold, either from a fire hidden in darkness or from some chemical reaction, started to wail. We had no time. The salvage men cut the hawsers. We shoved off with the living and left the dead to the deck. We watched as the Ourang Medan's funnels darkened. A sheet of fire like a sliver rose from her hold. We pointed and then turned and rowed away. Behind us, we heard the hull sigh. And then the world gave us sound again. The small sound of our oars in water. The voice of men swearing and calling. A second later came the boom. Not a small one. A sound that split the air. It threw us forward. I remember the taste of salt and the sharp stench of burning. The sky lit red for a heartbeat. When the aftershock passed, the ship was no more. We picked at the sea for bones, for things that floated. We found nothing except a few charred planks, a small piece of metal that might have been a nameplate, and the dead dog's collar. It lay like a relic of some private sorrow. Men argued for days. Newspapers called it sensational. Skeptics said it was a story made to sell ink. Some said the ship never existed. Others said it was a cover-up. But we had felt the cold under our hands. We had tasted the smoke. We had watched the eyes of men betray the raw shock that steals a life. After that night, I could not sleep without checking the corners of my room. I woke to small noises and my heart leapt. I checked the radio again and again. I feared the tap-tap of Morse, not because I wanted to be a hero, but because I had learned that the sea keeps secrets. And sometimes those secrets cough them back up in terrible shapes. When I tell this story now, I am older. My voice is not as steady. I mean no lie. I do not embellish for drama. What I tell you is what I felt. A sound, a silhouette, the white faces under a cold sky, and then the fire. You will ask me, what killed them? I cannot answer with certainty. Some say gas from the cargo, a slow, invisible poison that takes the lungs. Others speak of a nitrate reaction, others of military cargo hidden, and the shame of men keeping secrets. And some, a few, whisper of strange radiation, or a terror so enormous it left no wound but the soul's flight. I am not a man of fantasy. I am a man of wires and dials and the practical art of sending a signal. But the night the Ourang Medan burned into my memory, I learned that some things at sea break the neat lines we like to draw. We like causes. We like explanations. We like to label tragedies and file them away. That night taught me to hold a pause, to give an empty space the respect of attention, to remember the men who lay with eyes wide open, to understand that not everything bows to reason. So listen when a distress call buzzes the night. Listen to the short words. Listen to the single sentence. For sometimes, help arrives too late. And sometimes, the answer is not a number or a test. Sometimes, the answer is only the echo of a ship that called out and then fell silent. I do not relish the telling, but if you listen with a quiet ear, you will hear the ocean's slow, steady tapping, and you will wonder what it is that we cannot name. That is all I can say. One man's night, one ship's ending, one memory that sits like stone under my tongue. Breathe, hold it, and then let it go back to the sea. I want to tell you about the day I first saw the High Aim 6. I will not pretend I walk away untouched. I still carry the smell of fish and diesel like a stubborn shadow. I still hear the hollow clank of a ship tied to the quay with no crew to claim it. If you listen closely, I'll tell it plain. What I saw, what we pieced together, and what it felt like to stand in a place where people had vanished. We got the call in the morning. A fishing vessel had been spotted drifting off the coast. Someone had flagged it from a plane. Then the sighting was confirmed by a patrol boat. The coordinates were given, like any coordinates. Numbers that point a searchlight in the dark. We steamed out, engines grumbling, the air sharp with salt and spray. The sea was a calm sheet that day, almost too calm for a fishing trawler that had been left to itself for God knows how long. When we came near, the high AIM 6 sat low in the water as though she had been settling in for a long sleep. At first glance, she looked in order, hull intact, no gaping holes, deck fittings in place. But the closer we got, the more wrong it felt. A rotten perfume rose from her, heavy and sour, the smell of tons of tuna gone bad. A seabird wheeled and then dove nearby, let out a harsh cry, and left. I remember thinking that stench would be what defined my memory of that vessel more than any name on her transom. We hauled her into the harbor under tow. It was an awkward procession, our small patrol, the dead boat in the middle, and the eyes of people along the shore coming out to sea. A fishing trawler, alone and drifting, becomes an island of curiosity. By the time she made the quay, the sun had climbed an inch higher and the gulls had begun to pick. Boarding her was like stepping into a paused life. The deck was littered with small things, cigarette butts, a pair of wet boots left as if someone had kicked them off in a hurry, a notebook with notes written in an anxious hand. The wheel had been left turned slightly to port. The nets in the stern sagged with the weight of ruined catch. I remember the cold metal under my palm when I took hold of a rail. It was not weathered the way a derelict is weathered. It still had recent life in it. Someone had been there not long before. Down below, the stench was almost physical. The hold was a mass of bodies, fish, stacked 3 tons deep, their scales dull, their eyes clouded. Maggots crawled in places where sunlight dared not reach. The air was thick and the floor slick. I walked careful, my boots sliding slightly on the wet planks. You could see the stress on the men who came with me, investigators, port officials, the local police. Their faces tightened as if clenched against nausea and the strain of ugly questions. One of the first odd things we noted was how well certain personal items were kept. Passports sat on the navigation bench still in a neat stack. Toothbrushes lay in a bathroom cup. A radio sat on the shelf, its channel silent. It was as if the crew had intended to come back the next morning, as if this had been an intermission and not an ending. We found the papers, ship logs, duty rosters, and something like a diary. The log recorded routine entries for the voyage. Coordinates, weather, speed. Then there was a gap. The handwriting stopped. Blank days. That absence felt louder than any illegible scrawl. It told us more than a long, frantic entry would have. Word reached us from across the islands that men were missing. Families had begun to call. Names were murmured, low and careful. Questions started to multiply. Where had they gone? Had they left in a skiff and been lost to weather? Had something happened on the boat itself? Theories grew in the quiet spaces between official statements. Rumor is quick and ruthless. Then, one day, an arrest. A man turned up in a small town, disheveled and frantic, and he was taken into custody. He was an Indonesian crewman who had disappeared from the High AIM 6 along with the others. He confessed, or at least he spoke in fits and pieces, and the story that followed did not fit the neat patterns we prefer. He told us they had been short on pay and had been treated harshly by the Taiwanese officers. There were disagreements over food, he said, and small cruelties that grew like mold in the dark. Emotions are not always a good match for a seafaring life, where tempers can be sharp and options thin. He said it began with an argument. Words were thrown like knives. Then a night of anger. Then an act that no one could take back. He said the captain and an engineer had been killed in a mutiny on board, and the crew, or those who remained, had abandoned the ship. He did not say exactly how. He said little that tied neatly into the questions we wanted answers to, in part because language and fear make confession messy. and in part because the facts themselves were messy. We had a man saying terrible things, a vessel with missing people, and mountains of rotten fish. Bodies were not found. That fact haunted me. The sea keeps its own ledger. Men and things are swallowed with no receipt. Some of the missing names became entries in a police file. Others became ghostly in the memories of their families. I went to those families when I could. I watched their grief move like a slow tide. Small tides, daily runes of ritual. They wanted more than an explanation. They wanted their men back. We cannot give that. There were practicalities to handle. An investigation, interviews, and the legal wrangling that comes when the law tries to bring firm shape to human chaos. There were questions about smuggling, whether the boat had carried hidden cargo or been involved in illegal activities that led to violence. There were rumors of debt and of threats. Men who had worked across seas often spoke of hard choices made out of desperation. You learn, in this work, that pressure bends decisions in ways people never imagine until they stand at the edge. Walking the decks again, days after the initial hurry, I noticed the small signs people tend to leave. A cigarette lighter stamped with a name. A child's photograph tucked in a locker. Little private things that anchor a life. Those details are cruelty when they confront loss. You see a man who loved a child, and you imagine that child growing up without him. Those images are a slow kind of punishment. I also remember the silence on that quay at night. People came to stand and stare at the tied ship as if it were a stage set. They whispered and guessed. Some blamed the crew. Some blamed the owners. The worst accusations are often the simplest, that people are capable of betrayal against one another for a slice of bread or a pocketful of cash. None of those statements brought the dead back. None of those statements made the smell go away. In time, the port held hearings. Officials from 3 countries corresponded, and an Indonesian man was charged. He told the court what he had told us, that there had been a mutiny, that the Taiwanese captain and engineer had been killed. The details were as imperfect as a net full of holes. The court weighed his words against the absence of bodies, against the forensic limits of a rotting hold, and against the testimony of others who either had no memory or no willingness to speak. The law arranged a verdict. The families listened. Some felt a measure of justice. Others felt cheated by the fact that answers were partial and the dead never returned to testify. After it was all said and done, the High Aim 6 became part of a string of stories about the sea's cruelty and human failing. Fishing towns retold the tale when new sailors came into pubs. It was a cautionary tale about how isolation amplifies greed and fear. It was whispered to young crews as an instruction to guard their watch, to respect their mates, and to keep the small kindnesses that keep men human. I will not romanticize what happened. People were hurt. People were possibly killed. There is no neat lesson that makes tragedy acceptable. But there is something we can take as a plain fact. When men are pushed, when isolation and hunger combine, when hierarchy and petty cruelty twist daily life, decisions are made that shatter families. That is the human part of the tragedy, not the sea, which only does what it does, but us. There were nights afterward when I could not sleep. I would find myself thinking about the man who had confessed, and whether confession was the act of a conscience or the act of a broken soul bargaining to be spared. I thought about the captain and the engineer, people with lives and names, and I pictured them in their last moments, frightened perhaps, betrayed certainly. I thought about the men who fled and whether they thought they could begin again. The sea keeps some things with iron privacy. Sometimes I go back to the quay, not out of duty but out of a personal need to close the loop in my head. The ship that was towed there no longer floats under that name. It was dismantled, a husk of metal and memory. They chopped at the hull and sold the steel by weight. I watched as the High Aim 6 was stripped, piece by piece, until only a memory remained moored to the wharf. There's a finality in seeing a thing broken down like that. It answers some questions. The boat will not drift again. It also leaves raw what you cannot fix. Missing men, grieving families, the uncertain measure of guilt. If you ask me now what the High Aim 6 taught me, I will tell you this plain truth. Tragedy rarely arrives fully formed. It is a series of small things, a wave of argument, a withheld paycheck, an insult that never got apologized for, decisions made at 2 a.m. Under the glare of lantern light that accumulate until someone snaps. The sea only witnesses. It does not choose. We choose. And sometimes, in the hush of night, the choice is wrong. I hold no illusions. There will be other lost boats and other bitter reckonings. The ocean is wide and generous with its indifference. All I can do is tell you the story as I remember it. The smell, the rotten catch, the passports, the confession, the absence. Remember the faces behind the words. Remember the families that kept their chairs empty. Remember that human cruelty is not an accident of the ocean, but an accident of the heart. If you ever find yourself on a boat and feel the tension rising between people, do not assume it is nothing. Make a call. Share a ration. Offer an apology. Pull someone aside before anger becomes a plan. The sea has taught me many harsh lessons, but the mildest and most urgent may be this: keep each other human. Because when you stop doing that, no law, no tow, no investigation can fully heal what gets broken. They towed her like a ghost, a hulking shape on a chain, silent, cold steel against colder sea. I remember the morning we first saw her. Fog wrapped the horizon, just a pale smear. Then a silhouette rose, a white hull, tiered decks, windows like sleeping eyes. They called her Lyubov Orlova, a name that sounded like an old song you half remembered. She's been a cruise ship once. People laughed and drank and danced beneath lights like stars. Now she floated empty, a city with no people. We were a small crew, a tug, a few hands. Our job was simple: bring her in, tow her to the breakers, cash for the owners, steel for someone's mill. Simple, clean work. The harbor had held her, impounded, paperwork and debts like anchors. They sold her for scrap, and that was the plan. A long tow, across the Atlantic, tow lines, tugs, and weather reports. We set off with charts and coffee and a kind of numb hope. At first, the sea was patient, glass flat. Seagulls skimmed like punctuation marks. We tied her up tight. Winches hummed. Lines strained and sang. I stood on our deck and watched that great shadow ride the swell. Her funnels were tall. Her lifeboat swung empty against her sides. The gangways were gone. The windows stared. You could feel a kind of wrongness. Not danger, exactly. Just the wrongness of a place built for laughter and sitting under bright lamps now left to rot in rain and wind. She smelled faintly of stale perfume and machine oil, a strange perfume for a thing that was mostly rust. Night fell. We kept a watch. I walked her decks at midnight. A ladder groaned. A sheet of metal rattled like a throat clearing. The wind pushed through corridors and carried small, sharp scents: mildew, damp upholstery, paper gone soft at the edges. Each cabin door was a blank mouth. I do not like blank mouths. We took her out into open water on a cold morning. Tow line taut as a promise. The radio chirped and then settled. We watched the shoreline shrink. Behind us, the ship breathed slow and hollow. Her brass glinted in the low sun like teeth. I remember thinking, how many nights were spent here? How many stories were told? And now the stories were only weight. Tow lanes are honest things. They take and they hold. We made steady miles at first. The ocean was a planner, following the map. Then weather reports changed their tone. A low front came in. Whitecaps rose and then took over. The tug strained. We tightened bit and cleat. The ship's bow began to yaw a little, then more. The sea has appetite for awkward things. She will make them awkwarder. Then The knock came. A small sound, but it meant everything. The towel line vibrated. A coil slipped. Papston hiccuped. We checked the gear quick. A man shouted. We hauled. But the line wasn't a rope. It was a tendon in a living thing, and it broke. The snap was blank and final, like someone cutting a line of light. For a second, the world smelled of salt and wire. The Lyubov Orlova swung slow. Her stern yawed like an animal dodging a blow. She was free. We threw out hawsers. We tried every trick we knew. Winches burned. Men shouted through teeth of the wind. But tonnage is a stubborn argument. She wouldn't come. The ocean slid between us like a cold hand. I saw the captain's face then. A tight, pale map. He swore and then hung his head. There is a kind of silence in that look that no one teaches you in the academy. It is the silence of a plan unmade. We circled her, tried to catch her bow to ride her down, tried to run a new bridle. For hours we chased a massive shadow on a churning stage. Night turned the sky to iron. The searchlights from our deck cut slices in which she drifted like a slow beast. Sometimes she faced us with a bow full of empty windows. Sometimes her bridge was a dark square. We called on the radio for help. Words got lost in the wind. At dawn, she was gone. Not sunk, not near, just gone. A blank where a city should be. We checked the A's. Her beacon had switched off. We felt small and foolish. A big thing had slipped a leash. The ocean had taken its gift and run. Days passed. We tried to find her. Planes circled. Reports flickered. A satellite pinged something far away. Her outline, pale like a bruise, moved west. She was a cold passenger on the Gulf Stream, sailing where no one had planned. Sometimes the news would call her a hazard, sometimes a mystery. We called her a problem. I remember watching the feeds, black dots and numbers. She moved in a slow, implacable line. No lights, no life, just metal and memory. I thought of chairs that would never be sat in again, chandeliers that would never glitter, the engine room quiet as a crypt. The world loves a ghost ship. Cable news loves a headline, but it is different when you are near it. The scale of it hits you then. The emptiness makes a sound, a hollow note that goes under skin. I felt it in my bones. It made sleep thin and shallow. Some men tried to climb aboard her when she drifted near a supply ship. They put on cold weather suits. They took lines and hooks. They were small against her bulk. They reached and sometimes hooked a rail. Then the sea would shudder and the rail would sting their palms and throw them back. A ladder would hang like a question. A door might open for a breath and then slam closed. It was as if the ship refused to be touched. There were stories. Local fishermen said they saw her ghost in fog. Others swore they saw flickers in her windows, lights that were not lights. I do not know. I saw mostly the practical, rust, peeling paint, the slither of barnacles. Nature takes a thing apart with patient economy. Even the grandest halls become kitchens for the small. Still, there is wonder in that scale. A ballroom the size of a block. A bridge full of knobs and dials no one cared to touch anymore. A bell that could have called thousands. All of it adrift and useless. And us, like ants, circling with ropes and plans. People ask why nobody boarded her finally. You can board an abandoned ship. People did. But the law and the insurance companies argued. There were risks. Environmental. Liability. No one wanted the bill if something went wrong. Sometimes, the work of saving a thing costs more than the thing itself. So we watched, and we measured, and we wrote reports. One night I dreamed she sank. In the dream, the sea opened like a mouth. The hull tipped, and the lights under the water glowed like a sad city. I woke with my heart beating snow. Dreams have a way of telling things your mouth won't. And then, The weather turned cruel. A storm came across the North Atlantic. Winds like fists, swell the size of buildings. The tug could not hold the line. Other tugs tried, but the sea was old and exacting. The ship pitched and rolled and took on the sea like a thing that had been waiting for permission. Bilges filled. Rust bloomed like sores. I remember a radio call. Short, professional, then static, then silence. The tug said, "She's sinking by the head." We watched images from a plane. A pale shape started to nose down. A funnel leaned under the waves. And then the Atlantic took its breath and closed. There were things in the news then. Environmental concerns. Questions about responsibility. Who owned her when she sank? Who paid for the salvage? No one wanted to sign a check for the sea. The ship went where ships go to die. A slow, sonorous end. After she disappeared, I kept thinking about the empty chairs, about the swing of a lamp above a table where no dinner would be served, about a steward's soles on a carpet that would never be walked again. I thought of all that had been built for comfort and spectacle, and how quickly it had been turned into scrap. Luxury undone into scrap metal. A kingdom unmade. For months afterward, every time I crossed open water, my eyes searched the horizon for that pale outline. Habit, maybe, or a hope for answers that would not come. Ships do not leave many traces. The ocean is good at forgetting. Sometimes I will tell this story and someone will laugh and say, "It's just a ship." And I say, "Yes, but the way the sea moves around an abandoned thing is a kind of reverence." Or maybe respect. Or maybe it is just physics. Either way, I felt it like a hand on my shoulder. If you ask me what fear felt like up close, it was not the roar of a storm. It was the quiet that followed. It was the knowledge that a huge city could drift by and no one inside would wake. It was the feeling that the world continued without the songs and lights and the laughter that had once filled that hull. In the end, Lyubov Orlova sank. She slid beneath the waves and became something that no longer took up space. Her windows filled with seaweed. Her chandeliers went dark forever. And the wake she left was broader than the physical distance she traveled. It reached into imaginations. It became a story of a modern thing turned old and useless. When I tell this now, I like to stand on a pier at dusk. I watch ships leave. I think of the people who once made her pulse. I think of chairs and music and how fragile the make-believe of staying afloat can be. So breathe. Imagine a ballroom with no dancers. Imagine cabins that no longer hear footsteps. Imagine a name on a bow that turns into a line in a report. That is what I remember. That is what I carry. And sometimes, just sometimes, when fog comes in low and the lights blur, I look out and I swear I see her shadow on the water. A pale bruise that might be memory, or might be nothing at all. Either way, the sea keeps its stories and the rest of us keep telling them.